Hello, everyone, and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so honored today to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin and her book, The Leadership Journey: How Four Kids Became President. And as always, we'd like to thank Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Company, for their continued support of Book Breaks. And we'd also like to thank viewers like you. And if you're a history student or teacher, we'd love to have you join us on the Book Breaks team. So please contact us at bookbreaks@gilderlehrman.org if you'd like to help us with the History Book Club. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan. Hey, Ryan. And without further ado, it is such a thrill to welcome Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is a New York Times bestselling author and Pulitzer Prize winner. She's also the author of No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, The Homefront in World War II, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, and Leadership in Turbulent Times. Doris, we're so thrilled to have you here today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with you. This is a really exciting adventure for all of us. This is terrific.
Yes. Now, this book is your first young adult book. Can you tell us why you felt like it was important to reach a young adult audience at this stage of your career?
Well, I think part of it was that I just worry that the young audience that we're talking about, young readers, have really lived through a really difficult time when you think about COVID and the polarization and the vitriol that's going on right now, that it seems a little odd to want to bring them back to the Civil War and the Great Depression or World War II. But somehow seeing how the leaders and the citizens got through those really difficult times, and we emerged not simply enduring, but we emerged with greater strength. I mean, the Civil War, though, 600,000 were killed and a terrible price was paid. On the other hand, slavery was gone. The original sin of slavery was gone, and the emancipation was secured, and the Union was restored. And the important thing is that the people living then, they didn't know how it would end. They lived with the same anxiety we live with today. So I figured if we could catapult people back to that time and they could go through it and see how it ended, I think that would give them hope and confidence about today. And similarly, if you go back to the Great Depression and that first day when FDR is about to give his inaugural, and somebody says to him, if your program works, you'll be one of the great presidents. If it fails, you'll be one of the worst. And he said, no, 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 I'll be the last. And similarly, in World War II, there was a fear that not only Western civilization, but democracy itself all over the world would be destroyed, and that somehow the people and the citizens and the leaders came through. And we know now that the Allies won World War II. We know the Depression came to an end. But if we can give young people a sense that we lived in a time when these great challenges were met, I think it might give them confidence. And at the same time, also, I just worry that history isn't being taught as much in schools. I'm so glad that there are some history teachers here who are doing such noble work, that it's so important to get history to these young children as much as we can. So I'm really to have taken a small part in that.
Absolutely. Well, the book is so rich with stories and details about your guys, as you call them. And I was wondering if you could tell us why you decided to write the book in this way and not just with sort of dates and random facts.
Now, I always think that stories are the best way to teach history and to think about history. Lincoln used to be asked why he told so many stories. And he said, because people remember stories better than facts and figures. The figures are important, the facts matter. But if you care about the people ahead of time, then you're going to care when they were born. You're going to care whether the Civil War came before Reconstruction or World War I before World War II. So the dates become part of the stories. And I also think that stories are just hardwired in our brain. When you think back to the old days before the printing was possible, people would tell stories to that next generation so that memories could be shared and go forward. So this is just a way of telling stories of people who lived before us and trying to recreate their daily lives almost as so you can feel that you're back in the Civil War or back at the turn of the 20th century. And I think that reaches people somehow in our brains in a way that we may not fully understand, but I think it does.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not wondering how you came about your love of history.
Well, it really started, I think, when I was only 6 years old, and my father taught me this mysterious love of keeping score while he went to work in the day. I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And somehow when he would come home with all my miniaturized symbols, I could recount every play of every inning of the game that had just taken place that afternoon. And he made me feel I was telling him a fabulous story. So it makes you think there's something magic about history to keep his attention. So that was part of it. He never told me then that all of this was actually described in the sports pages of the newspapers the next day. So I thought without me, he wouldn't even know what happened to the Brooklyn Dodgers. So it was pretty special. But it was also true, as I think is so often true, of where does a love of something come from? I had a fabulous teacher in high school in Rockville Center, New York, and she actually won an award as one of the best teachers in New York State. And what she did was to tell us stories about the people who lived before, and she made us feel that she really knew them in a certain sense. I remember when she got up to the point of Lincoln dying, she actually cried, and I thought, oh my God, she must have known him because she
Yeah.
crying up there. And she also, what she did was to make us read the New York Times every day. And then she would bring to bear whatever was happening in current events on the history of the past. And it was such an interesting time in the late 1950s with Rosa Parks refusing to go to the back of the bus, and with what was going on at Little Rock. And somehow we related that to history, so it felt relevant. And I think that's it's always a teacher there. The love of the teacher communicates to you. And then I wanted to be a high school teacher. That was my dream when I went to graduate school.
Yes, well, we have a ton of high school teachers in our audience today. I know we're grateful to hear that from you. Now, you've written a ton of books about leadership, from Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, your mentor, to Abraham Lincoln. And I was wondering if you could tell us some themes in their leadership abilities. If there's some keys that you could point out to us.
Yeah, what I really tried to look for when I was writing about them, especially writing about them as boys, I called my presidents my guys. I don't mean to be irreverent. It's just that it takes me so long to write these books that I feel like I wake up with them in the morning. I go to sleep thinking about them at night. I lived with Lincoln or lived with FDR longer than anyone other than my husband, so that they become part of my life. But I really was looking for a master key. Is there anything that sort of links all of them together? And there's not a single leadership trait, but there really were, I found, a family resemblance of leadership traits. And maybe the first one is humility. And that's not humbleness. It means that you can acknowledge that you don't know things. You can acknowledge that you're going to make mistakes. And I think about Lincoln especially with that, because he had such a hard time even getting books where he was. He didn't have a formal schooling, only 1 year of formal schooling. But when he would get a book on Shakespeare or Aesop's fables, he was so excited. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. But at a certain point, despite all his reading, he realized he'd never had formal grammar. So when he went to write, he didn't know, he isn't or he ain't or something like that. So he had to ask somebody to say, I don't know grammar. And that willingness to be humble to ask. And somebody said, there's a grammar book 20 miles from here. He started walking right away to get it that day. So I think that was one of the qualities that really matters. Empathy is so important. And I think some kids are born with it. Lincoln seemed to be born with that. There's stories after stories where, for example, his friends were teasing a boy who stuttered, and he went to them and said, this is just wrong. Why are you doing this? Or they would put hot coals on turtles to make them wriggle. And he would say again to them, and he was big and strong, so his authority was listened to. And I think it was inborn in him, but sometimes it's developed for Teddy Roosevelt, who came into the world always wanting to be the center of attention. They said he liked to be the baby at the baptism, the bride at the wedding, and the corpse at the funeral. And when he went into the state legislature, he was just popping up and down all the time, making speeches that were really quite troubling to the opponents, but they made headlines because everybody liked it. But then he finally realized that this wasn't working, and he was able to acknowledge that he developed a swelled head. So he had that humility as well. But the empathy came when there was a law that was being passed to prevent cigars from being made in tenement houses owned by absentee owners. And there were terrible conditions in which the working immigrants were. And he said he wasn't going to sign it because he didn't think government should regulate business in that way. But they asked him, will you just take a look at it? And he went, and when he saw the conditions, something developed in his heart. He felt what they were being forced to live into. And he then became a champion of the bill, and he helped get it through. So that's how empathy can come through, I think. And then there's resilience. All of them went through adversity. I think sometimes when a leader goes through adversity and comes through the other end, they get self-reflection and maybe even a little wisdom. And obviously, Ernest Hemingway once said, everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some are strong in the broken places. And that was so true of Lincoln. His whole life was filled with challenges. Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and mother on the same day in the same house, and he became a different person after that. And of course, FDR had his polio, and that paralysis really made him understand other people to whom fate had dealt an unkind hand. And Lyndon Johnson, too, had an experience when he was teaching. He had left college for a year to teach at a small Mexican-American community at a grammar school. And the kids came to school, they hadn't had anything to eat. They knew that people were not liking them because of the color of their skin, but they didn't understand why. And his empathy was so developed toward them, that he gave part of his salary to develop athletic events for them. And most importantly, much, much later, he talked about what that experience had meant to him when he was young. So, and then there's accountability. And I think one of the largest things that you see combining in all of them is everybody starts with an ambition for self, but sometimes it becomes an ambition for something larger than self. I remember George Bush told a story of his mother one day when he was coming home from school, and he said, "I scored 3 goals in soccer." And his mother said, "Yes, dear, but how did the team do?" In other words, sense of ambition for something larger. And it may be for a young kid in school to, be the head of their class or the head of their athletic team. Later, it could develop into being a leader in any kind of organization, but somehow that transition takes when you want something for the greater good. So all of those things I could see as my boys developed, that they evolved into those qualities. And it's wonderful to watch them, because I think it's so hard for people if they're young. I was giving a talk one day at a college, and a student said to me, "I'll never be one of those presidents like you're talking about, Roosevelt or Lincoln. They're on Mount Rushmore, they're heroes, they're on the currency." So I realized if I could bring the presidents down to when they're boys and they're just developing these leadership traits and they're making mistakes and they're sometimes arrogant or they're sometimes scared or they don't speak as well as they later learn how to speak in public, that maybe young people could identify with them. So that's really why I did it in this way.
Absolutely. And thinking about their childhoods, in your research, did you find a lot of these leadership traits were inborn or developed over time?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I remember when I was in graduate school, these are the kind of nerdy things we would go out at night asking ourselves, are they inborn or do they develop over time? Or does the man make the times or the times make the man? Some things are inborn. Certainly, I think with Lincoln, that empathy was inborn. You saw it when he was so young. He had a gift for language that was inborn. With Teddy, I think there was a curiosity that he just had from the time he was really, really little. And it meant that that's one of the reasons it extended to wanting to know birds. Hobbies become really important for these young people. I think about that with the young people out there. When you can master something, it gives you a sense of really learning a whole little world. And he got interested in birds in part because he had had asthma. So he had to be outside a lot in order to get healthy and his lungs get stronger. And then he got interested in insects. And the next thing you know, his drawers are filled in his room with all sorts of insects. And his brother begged for a different room. And then when FDR was young, he loved stamps, and he had an inborn quality of optimism. I think we are sometimes born with an optimistic or a melancholy temperament. You can change it over time depending on what happens. And that was a gift to him. But then he developed interest in things as well, just like Teddy did. And he had a stamp collection when he was young. And then he used that stamp collection to figure out, where did the stamp come from? And then he learned what country it came from and look at the encyclopedia and learn the natural geography of the country and the history of the country. He learned on his own accord in a certain sense. So I think, as I say, some of these qualities are good, but most of the time you develop and you make it through hard work. Teddy Roosevelt had this great saying once. He said that there's 2 kinds of success in the world. One is if you have such an extraordinary qualities or gifts that no one can probably emulate you. Maybe a great poet or a great dramatist like Shakespeare. But most people, he said, have ordinary qualities that they develop to extraordinary degrees through hard, sustained work. And that's what I saw in all of my boys.
Yes. And now thinking again of these presidents, they were all served during very turbulent times. And thinking of Lincoln, what lessons can we learn from his tenure in office?
Well, what's so interesting, I think, is you can see those qualities they developed as boys becoming critical in that moment of great challenge. For example, when Lincoln first won the election, that night he couldn't sleep. And he had that humility again to know, oh my God, am I really ready for this job? He'd only had 1 term in Congress and a few terms in the state legislature. So he decided that he needed to surround himself with people who were stronger than him. And he brought his 3 chief rivals into his cabinet. And that meant that he was able to understand where they were coming from. People said, oh, you can't do this. You're going to look like a figurehead. And he said, no. He said, even though they're more powerful than me, they're more experienced than me. They each think they should be president instead of me. I need them because the country's in peril, and these are the strongest and most able people in the country. So you saw that childhood trait develop into that humility that was one of the defining moments of his presidency, to surround him with these rivals. And then at the end of his presidency, you see how empathy, again, that trait that was so important to him when he was a young child, becomes so important when the North is on the eve of winning the Civil War. No triumphal message does he deliver. In that great, great second inaugural, he talks about the fact that both sides read the same Bible, both prayed to the same God. Neither's prayers were fully answered. And then the famous words where he reaches out to the South after this terrible war with malice toward none and charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. So I think there you can see that, that development of those qualities, and then he becomes the leader who's ready for that extraordinary challenge.
Yeah, and thinking along those lines then with Teddy Roosevelt and the Industrial Revolution, what did you observe in that?
Well, what the Industrial Revolution had done really was to shake up the economy, much like the tech revolution and the globalization have done today. And it was a time that was really, really an anxious time for many people because people from the country were moving into the city, and the city had exploited workers, and a lot of immigrants were there. There was nativist spirit against the immigrants, much like we see today in many ways. There were lots of new inventions, and it was a kind of scary time for a lot of people because automobiles and telephones had changed the pace of life, much as we've experiencing today. And people on the East Coast felt suspicious of people in the heartlands and vice versa. And because Teddy had lived in various parts of America, he had gone to the Dakotas after his wife died. In such a state of depression was he needed to get away, that he actually became not just an Eastern dude that he'd been before, with his glasses and the kind of dress that he would wear. He now was a cowboy. So he was able to relate to the people in the West in a way that he might not have from his privileged background in the East. And then when he joined the Rough Riders, he brought into his soldiers, his regiment that he did in the Spanish-American War. His friends from Harvard and Yale were next to Wranglers and cowboys, and they got to work together. So he was able to sort of absorb into himself all these divisions in the country. He had once said that democracy is in peril if people in different regions or sections or parties view each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. So he took a train and he went all around the country with a single message: the square deal for all, the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the laborer. And that's what made it work during his period of time.
And then speaking of turbulent times, then we have FDR, who led the country during the Great Depression. How did he sort of use his skills from his childhood to help lead the country during that time?
Well, I think part of it was that optimistic temperament that he was lucky to be born with. But then probably even more important than that was that he had come through his own paralysis. I mean, he was only in his 30s when he had polio and was never able to walk on his own power again. And it took him 7 years from the time he got the polio in 1921 and 1928 when he ran for governor to come back into public life. And during that time, he had tried out so many experimental things to figure out what will help him to get his upper body stronger. And he had patience. He had to have patience. It took him 2 years, he said, to move his big toe. Somebody said to him, you go through such difficult times. How do you get through the pressure? He said, well, if it takes you 2 years and you can celebrate moving your big toe, you have that sort of patience. But I think most importantly, he created Warm Springs, a rehabilitation center for his fellow polio patients. And while he was there, he learned to deal with people that were so different from the privileged class from which he had grown. And he was able to give them a sense of joy and purpose back in their lives. They had wheelchair dances. They played polo in the pools. He had theatricals at night. And he learned to be a real leader then, I think, before he's called upon to come in when the country is in paralysis. And at that first inaugural, he's able to exude that confidence he had in himself, the optimism he felt. He said, only a foolish optimist would deny the realities of the moment, which are brutal. But the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then he said, you people are not at fault. It was leadership that failed, and I'm here to take responsibility for that leadership. And so contagious was his optimism that at the end of that speech alone, the mood of the country had changed. People wrote in, we have a leader. There were headlines. Our government still lives. And it was an extraordinary time. And hundreds of thousands of letters went into the White House. And one that I loved the most, a man said, my roof fell off. I've lost my job. My wife is mad at me, but everything's okay because you are there. That's the mystery of leadership. And I think that developed from that confidence and optimism and the trouble that he went through and came out the other end.
Now, and speaking of leadership too, your final president you cover is Lyndon Johnson, who took office right after a tragic assassination of JFK. Can you tell us how he rose to meet that tragic time?
Yeah, I mean, the extraordinary thing about Lyndon Johnson is that he had loved talking to people ever since he was little. He loved listening to them. He loved telling stories to them. His father had been a state legislator, so he went about on the campaign trail with them. So he'd worked his way up through all of the House of Representatives and the Senate. He was the most powerful minority leader, most powerful majority leader of the Senate. But he had a heart attack when he was in his 40s. And he was very depressed when he came out of it. And for days, they really could hardly get him to move from the bed in the hospital. Then one day he suddenly woke up and he said, "Get me shaved. I'm ready to go forth." And they said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, I was lying here wondering and worrying that what if I died now? What would I be remembered for?" And he began to realize he had developed power, he developed wealth, but he wanted to use it for some good. And he went back to the Senate and he got the first civil rights bill through the Senate. It wasn't very powerful, but at least it was the first one that had happened. So when John Kennedy died, and he had to make a decision as to what is my first priority going to be when he went to the joint session of Congress, he decided it would be for civil rights to get the bill that John Kennedy had tried to get through Congress but failed. And his advisor said, "You can't make that your first priority. It'll fail, and the filibuster will never be broken. You'll be a failed president when you go forward the next November. You only have a certain currency to expend, and you can't expend it on this." So then he said to them the famous line. He said, "Well, then what the hell is the presidency for?" And he went for civil rights, which was a very brave thing to do. But he had had a whole history of bipartisanship in the Senate, and he knew the Senate and he knew the House, and he was able to somehow call people at 6 in the morning, call them at midnight, he even called senators at 2 a.m. "I hope I didn't wake you up." And the senator said, "No, I was just lying here hoping my president would call." And somehow he was able to get Republicans to come with the Democrats in the North, since the South was broken away. And or Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, he finally gets him to come. He gives him everything he wants, public works projects. I'll come to Peoria, I'll come to Springfield. He finally says to him, "Everett Dirksen, if you come with me on this bill and bring Republicans, school children 200 years from now will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen." How could you resist? And he gets that civil rights bill through. And then he goes forward and he wants more. He wants a great society. He wants voting rights. He wants to, help people who do not have the access to goods and resources in the society that others do. So that really developed, I think, from that adversity that he went through, as so often happens with the other guys, as I said.
Yeah, and something you do so beautifully in the book is you show really these figures as flesh and blood people, warts and all. I was telling to know why you decided to sort of show the full body of these men, sort of in some of their mistakes as well as their triumphs.
Oh, I think it's so perfect it's so important rather, that we understand that none of them are ever going to be perfect. They're going to disappoint us. Of course they are. Every human being has their own failings. So you'll watch them making mistakes. You'll watch them, as I said, acknowledging those mistakes. You'll watch them when they don't speak too well. When FDR first was on the campaign trail, Eleanor was there and she said he paused so often, she was afraid that he'd never go on, and then eventually he got so confident, she was afraid he'd never go off the stage. More importantly, they're all limited by the context of their times. I mean, people got sad when they knew later that El, that Abraham Lincoln was for the black codes, which prevented blacks from being on juries. Everybody in Illinois who was in politics had to do that, but it's still disappointing to find that out. Certainly, when we know that FDR didn't bring as many Jewish refugees into the country at a time when Hitler was still allowing people to leave, it makes you sad. Eleanor said it was the greatest scar on his legacy. And there's going to be times when even the best of leaders are going to not only be limited by the context of their time, but by they may do something that's not right, or that a later generation thinks isn't right. And we shouldn't sugarcoat that, because we learn that from some of these terribly hard experiences, sometimes great growth takes place, not only in the person, but in the society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we get to Ryan and our student question of the week and our audience questions, I just wanted to end with the idea of legacies. And you write that all your guys thought about how they might be remembered and that they hoped they would be making the lives of their citizens better. They all developed an ambition for something larger themselves. Is that how history remembers them?
Yeah, I think so. Each one, FDR wanted to be remembered for the bond he had established with the people. More than anything, he said in his library there would be hundreds of state papers, but what he cared about was the letters from the citizens. And that trust the people had in him, I think, was really critical, not only during the Depression, but World War II. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be remembered for civil rights more than anything, and he hoped that the scar of the war in Vietnam would not cut away from that. And I think as time's gone by, people realize more and more what he was able to do on civil rights. But Lincoln, of all of them, really had this obsession with wanting to be remembered for having done something worthwhile after he died. I think it stemmed from the fact his mother died when he was only 9. And she said to him, Abraham, I'm going away from you now, and I shall never return. So he became obsessed with what happens to us after we die and got solace in the thought that if we could accomplish something worthy, then maybe he would be remembered after he died. And of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation, when he signed that bill, he said to his great friend who had known him during a period of time when Lincoln was in a Great Depression, and he said to his friend, well, maybe now I will be remembered as I had hoped. But even Lincoln could not have imagined how far his reputation would reach. I was so happy to find an extraordinary interview with Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer, at the turn of the 20th century with a New York reporter who was over in Russia. And Tolstoy told a story that showed how far Lincoln's reputation had reached. He said he'd just come back from a remote area of the Caucasus, very far from everywhere, where there were a group of barbarians, they called themselves, who had never left that part of Russia. And they were so excited to have Tolstoy in their midst, they asked him to tell stories of the great men of history. So I told them about Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Frederick the Great, and they seemed to love it. But before I finished, the chief stood up and he said, but wait, you haven't told us of the greatest ruler of them all. We want to hear about that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise, who came from that place called America that's so far from here that if a young man should travel there, he'd be an old man when he arrived. Tell us of that man. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln. Tolstoy was stunned to know Lincoln's name had reached this far, so he told him everything he could about him. And then what so struck me was the reporter said to him, okay, so what made Lincoln so great after all? And Tolstoy said, well, he wasn't as great a general as Napoleon, perhaps not as great a statesman as Frederick the Great, but his greatness consisted ultimately in his character. In other words, it was not simply what he did, but who he was. And that's the most important lesson I think I'd like young people to understand, that the development of character, whether it's humility and empathy and resilience or accountability, kindness and compassion and an ambition for something larger, is what we really want in our kids. It's what our teachers want in our students. It's what we want in our leaders. So if young people can feel the importance of developing character, then I would feel hopefully that they can really learn from these guys when they were boys.
I think that's such an amazing lesson, especially for the classroom right now after sort of a rough last few months. This book gives people a lot of hope and insight, I feel like, into the whole process. So thank you. I'm going to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to start us off with our student scholar question of the week.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina, for that amazing back and forth. Such a treat to listen to. And as Gina accurately stated, we begin this portion of our program every week with our history scholar question of the week. This is just as a reminder, this is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question. And the winning question will not only be read aloud to our esteemed guests, but the winner will also receive a $50 gift card for themselves and their teacher. And this week, our winner is Nora Davis, who's a student in Mr. Marsh's class. And the question is this: my history research class is reading your book, The Leadership Journey. Right now is a study on leadership and service. I was wondering, as you studied these presidents, which leadership qualities have been most important in your life? Which qualities have you adapted or tried to adapt in the ways that you live your life? Thanks so much, Nora, for that great question.
What a great, great question. I'd like to think that somehow resilience is one of the most important qualities that I've had to deal with in my life. My mother died when I was only 15 years old, and yet she had loved books at every spare moment she could find. She had had a heart condition, which made it hard to leave our house very much. And she read to me every night when I would be going to sleep, that dream that you don't have to go to sleep as long as you're still reading a book. And then she would tell me stories of the days when she was young before her illness set in. And I loved listening to stories about her. And my father died when I was in my 20s, so that I was able to eventually write a book about my love of baseball with my father and bring my mother and father to life again. So that really, in a certain sense, that resilience of getting through that and hoping that that gave me a sense of reflection and wisdom later on. And made me want to bring other people back to life. Maybe that was part of the reason why I've written books about people who are no longer alive and tried to know that they can really live on in the memories of others, just like my parents now lived on in the memory of the books that I've written about baseball and my mother and father. And now finally the book about my husband, who died while we were working on a joint project together about his life in the 1960s. And now I'm still talking about him. So he's alive in my mind as well. So that's the wonderful thing about history. It really does allow you to tell the peoples whose stories are no longer there, and you can tell them to the next generation.
Wow. Thank you so much for that insightful answer. Nora, great question.
Great question.
Yeah, keep them coming. Carol from our audience says, speaking of stories, I was lucky enough to sit next to you on a bus at the NEH Teacher Seminar, and I asked you about Team of Rivals, and it was just a wonderful discussion. So thank you for that. But the question is this. My question to you is about Lincoln and why, with so much empathy and sympathy that Lincoln developed within himself as he grew older, do you think he was never able to fully reconcile with his father, even in later years?
It's a mystery to me. That's an extraordinary question, because he was able to look at the South and give empathy toward them when so much more difficulties had happened. What people may not realize is just the father had been very tough on him, thought that his reading was a waste of time, sometimes took his books away from them, sometimes destroyed them. So they had a very difficult childhood and fatherhood. But you thought he did finally go back, and even at the very end, when he was called to see him, he just didn't want to go. He finally went back and put something on his gravestone, and in a way that was a way of coming to terms with it afterwards. But it's very difficult for me to understand that everything I know about him would have said that he would have wanted somehow to understand where the father was coming from in a difficult situation, trying to make ends meet, a farm that was very hard scrabble. It's a mystery to me. If I were to go together with Lincoln and people would say, what would you want to ask him? That's one of the things I'd love to ask him. So that's a very insightful question.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you, Carol, for that great question. Homer from our audience asks if you could talk a little bit about the relationships and also the legislation that was passed and the relationships developed with these four individuals with African-American men and women throughout their lives. Sweeping question, but I think it's an important one. Yeah.
Well, obviously with Lincoln, the most important thing was when he came to that decision that it was time to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a very, very complicated decision because there were people in the North who thought it was the wrong thing to do. It wasn't simply that the South would be, extraordinarily upset with it and keep the war going for as long as they could to not have to undo slavery. But the people in the North had real mixed feelings about it because they were afraid the war would not come to an end. And yet he knew the time had come. And then most importantly, he also understood then that he wanted to invite Black soldiers to be in part of the army, which he had not been sure about before. And they performed so heroically and they had such courage that it really made people on the white side who were soldiers with them realize that this was a great thing to do, to have integrated the armies in that way. So I'd say, obviously, we know about Lincoln. Teddy Roosevelt has a more checkered history with Black Americans. He was the first president to invite Booker T. Washington to dinner in the White House, and it made such an outrageous comments on the part of the South that he was trying to intermarry blacks and whites, and he got a lot of criticism for it, and sadly never did it again. That he learned something from that, and not in a good way. You would hope that he would have he's had such a fighting spirit. You would have hoped he would have said, "Okay, I'm going to keep doing it no matter what." And there's also an incident when he was president with a group of people who were being court-martialed that he didn't think about it too well, I think. But then I'd look at Lyndon Johnson or FDR, and FDR, Eleanor would say she needed him, I think, in many ways to remind him of what needed to be done for Black Americans. She was, as he said, a welcome thorn in his side, always willing to argue with him, always willing to question his assumptions. And she was ahead of him on civil rights. She was always there. And she sent so many memos to General Marshall about discrimination in the Army during World War II that he had to assign a separate general whose only task was to deal with Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was responsible for his having created the Fair Employment Practice Commission. So I think he needed Eleanor to move ahead on civil rights. Not that he was against it, but during World War II, he was just anxious to work on the war itself and the social changes that had to take place, she could see more clearly than he. Lyndon Johnson, it turns out, of all of them except for Lincoln, I think his convictions were deeply there by the time he became president. And
Mm.
it's not only civil rights, but the whole Great Society was an attempt, I think, to give not only African Americans, but people of color and also poor people a chance to, as Lincoln would say, that the goal of a democracy is to allow everybody to rise to the level of their talent and discipline. And then even after civil rights, he went for voting rights in 1965 after Selma. And my husband was lucky enough to help work on that speech, the famous "We Shall Overcome" speech. I remember him saying, God, how I loved Lyndon Johnson that night when his speech was so powerful that it produced the voting rights legislation 5 months later. So they all had times that they lived in, and some of them outlived their times. Some of them were greater than their times, and some were restricted by the time. So again, these are great questions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should also just mention, I know many on the in the audience right now are also huge fans of your book, which details your life with your husband. And there's links in the chat for our anxious audience to get their hands on that book as well. And we encourage everyone really to do so. We have an interesting question from Kim, who asks, were there any other presidents that you considered writing about that didn't quite make the cut? I'm sure many, but were you close to changing the four core group, or was it that group from the start?
Oh no, if I had started earlier in life, I would love to have written about George Washington. I mean, he's right there with all my guys without even a question. He establishes so many precedents that are so important. But I knew by the time I reached finishing the last one that it would take another 10, 15 years to do George, because that's how long it would be deserving of it. And luckily, I was able to work with the History Channel. They had come to me to ask me to work on a documentary on George Washington. And that meant that I had a whole team that I could work with, a team of production people, the people at the History Channel, and my partner, Beth Lasky, and I. And so within 2 years, rather than 10 years, a documentary came out on George Washington. And I felt like I just learned from the George Washington scholars. It was not only experts that were interviewed in a normal documentary form, but there was actually actors who played the major characters. So I got to talk to the actor who played George, and I really learned about George as a result of this. And so that gave me the feeling that yes, he would have been somebody had I started when I was 15 writing these books, and then been so old when I am now.
Wow, fantastic. Linda asked an interesting question, I think. Linda says, teaching middle school, your comment about young people engaging with stories resonates with my experience. Another motivator she feels for middle schoolers is their friendships. Did any of these men as boys have impactful friendships that you think were helpful for them later in life?
Oh, again, yes, I think for Lincoln it was most important. So he developed a friendship with his young friend named Joshua Speed, who owned a store, a general store where they would all gather, all the politicians. And when Lincoln went in there to buy a mattress, when he first came to Springfield as the state legislator, he didn't have enough money to pay for it. So he said, but I promise you I'm starting law and I'll be able to do it in times. And he said, I see how worried you are about this. He could tell he knew about Lincoln. He said, why don't you go upstairs, and I have a big room up there and you can stay there. And he stayed there. And the two of them became really the most intimate friend that I think Lincoln ever had. And it was Joshua Speed who, when Lincoln was in that depression I mentioned earlier, he had his state legislature career had a bump. He had broken his engagement with Mary Todd. And most importantly, Joshua Speed was leaving Illinois, his friend, to go back to Kentucky because his father had died. And he said something then, Lincoln said, the terrible thing about friendship is if you don't have any friends, you're lonely. But if you have them, they care so much, you care so much for them that it can really hurt you when they go away. But he fell into a depression with all those things happening at the same time. And it was Joshua who came to his side and said, Lincoln, you must rally or you will die. They'd taken all knives and razors and scissors from his room. They were so worried about him. And it was then that he said, I'd just as soon die now, but I've not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I have lived. And then he stayed friendly with Joshua. Joshua lived in Kentucky. He went back there. So he was very helpful on that border state during the war. And then it was Joshua who came to the White House, as I said, after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And it was to Joshua that he said, perhaps with this, my fondest wish has been realized. So that friendship was enormously important to him throughout his life.
Wow, fascinating. And keeping with this theme of teaching and our great teachers in the audience, Elliot Powell asks a really important question, I think. He says, I teach history in a school with lots of students from different backgrounds and races. How can I explain to my students that the empathy shown by people in your book did not always extend to people that looked like them and help to ingrain empathy among different looking people in my classroom?
Wow. I think it's just a matter of explaining that the people we're reading about were human with the limitations that human beings have,
Mm,
and that they had, they had parts of themselves that could be extraordinary and other parts of themselves that make you sad. And I think
mm,
it's very, very honest to be able to feel like you wish they were different. You care about them so much. How could they have not extended it to other people, as the question rightly says? And it's just a realization that none of us have all the qualities at the same time we wish we did, that everyone disappoints one another some way along the time, but you still have to make the balance. I mean, I chose the people I wrote about because I knew that in balance that I'm going to respect them and want to live with them and want to spend time with them. I myself would have a really hard time writing about a Mussolini or a Stalin or a Hitler just to wake up with them in the morning. I have such respect for my colleagues who do so. But when you're dealing with people who you really do basically respect and have affection for, and they do things that you wish they had not done, or they cannot extend empathy, as was said in the question, to other people, you just feel sad, and you have to acknowledge that sadness. And you know that probably somebody else 100 years from now will look at us and say, how could we have treated X or Y in the way we're doing now? And they'll be disappointed in us as well.
yes, very true. And thank you for that important question and great answer. As you know, as you well know, I'm going to try to put a couple of different questions together into one because I think it's important. Primary sources are so important in education and in teaching. Are there any really cornerstone speeches that you think are important given by the four presidents that you study that would be really resonate well with our middle school or high school students that teachers should consider incorporating?
Well, and maybe it's because I've just finished The Unfinished Love Story, the history of the 60s with my husband,
Yes.
that he had saved everything, 300 boxes of speeches and memos and diaries and journals and letters. And when we came together to the box where it was the Johnson speech that he helped him with, the We Shall Overcome speech, it really was, I think, one of the most important speeches of the 20th century, because what happens in that speech is that in the Selma event that took place in 1965, when the peaceful marchers led by John Lewis were going across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Alabama to march to Montgomery to protest the failure of the right to vote among African Americans, they were met by the Alabama state troopers, who tore into the crowds with their horses and their whips and their clubs and hospitalized many of them. And it was all captured on television, and it fired the conscience of the country. And that's when change takes place in our country, when the sentiment of the country is moved, and then the people in power then respond to that. Because Johnson wasn't planning to do voting rights that year. He thought he needed to get the civil rights to have a year to be absorbed, but he decided to make a speech that the next night almost, or a week later anyway, on after Bloody Sunday. My husband was tasked with working on that. And the day he worked on it, just the words from it, just they're so important. He started out, it took him 2 hours of the 9 hours he had to write the speech to come up with the first line. And it was beautiful, the line he came up with: I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. And then he put Selma in a historic context. He said, at times, history and fate meet at a certain place at a certain time in man's unending search for freedom. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was in Selma, Alabama. This is not a Negro problem, not a Northern problem, not a Southern problem, it's not a moral problem. It's simply wrong to deny your fellow Americans a right to vote. It is an American problem, and we are met here tonight, not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans to meet that problem. And then he went out to get a cigar and to take a break during the afternoon, and he heard people in the distance singing, We Shall Overcome. So he then came back in and lined the words with Johnson delivered with such conviction, saying, but even if voting rights get established, there's still a century of bigotry and oppression to overcome. But, if we work together, and then he paused and he said, we shall overcome. which meant that the anthem of the civil rights movement that had provided such bravery and courage to the civil rights marchers over the years was being lifted to the highest levels of power in the joint session of Congress. And that's when change takes place. So I think that's one of those questions when words really matter, and words can inspire, words can hurt, words can divide, words can unite. But I partly the pride in my husband knowing the role he played, and the pride in Lyndon Johnson, with whom I worked later, being able to deliver that with such conviction, is one of the great speeches of the 20th century. That's not maybe as well known as some of the other speeches that we have in terms of all history, from the Gettysburg Address, to the second inaugural, FDR's first inaugural. It belongs in that pantheon, I think.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it's so timely that you've just mentioned that and recited that so beautifully. We've heard from so many teachers in our audience and students who are really focusing now. There's such and I think it's a wonderful thing, renewed interest in the civil rights movement, the 1960s as a topic in history and civics education. So we really encourage everyone to take that speech, take those words to heart, back into your classroom.
What you're saying, I think it's so important. I think to do that right now, because what the civil rights movement represents is people who believe they could make a difference. And that was the spirit of the 1960s. I was at the Civil Rights March in 1963, and it was the first time I ever felt a sense of being part of something larger than myself. I was carrying a sign, Blacks, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants unite for civil rights. And I think if people can see what happened in the civil rights movement, not only did it make great accomplishments for African Americans, it was accomplishments for America. We became a better nation as a result of it. But the way they did it with that discipline and that bravery and that courage and the patience is something that I think young people have to learn today, because it's so hard when you want to make a difference and you don't know exactly where to do it. But that's such a marker. It's such a great emblem for how that change brought about by individuals who believed in themselves and in their collective identity.
Yes, coalition building, right, in the best possible way.
Exactly.
Yes. Karen asks, and that this is all fantastic, and bringing to our boys, as we say. Karen asks, all men must have an inherent drive to and ambition to succeed as they did, but how much influence do you think these four young boys' parents or their parental figures contributed to their success later in life? How did they drive that drive, so to speak?
It's a really complicated question, because if we think about Lincoln, obviously his mother had died, although she did teach him reading, they think. We know so little about some of these things that are happening to him, but it may be that having to resist the father's problems and the father's challenges to him made him the person he was, that he was able to learn on his own. And then that became part of his identification the whole rest of his life, to depend on himself. With Teddy Roosevelt, there's no question that his father was a huge figure in his life. He adored his father. They were best friends. His father was a great philanthropist in New York City, having come from a very wealthy family himself. And he just respected him so much. And when his father died, when he was in college, he thought that his life was broken in part. But he then decided that my father would want me to go on. He would want me to not keep going. And he wanted to emulate the father's having done good things for people by getting into politics himself. And so I think that was huge for him. For FDR, it was probably his mother more even than the father. His father died when he was in college, but his mother loved him so much. He was the center of her life. So he then became the center of a lot of other people's lives, and she believed in him, and he knew the rest of his life that she would do anything she needed to do for him, almost to the point where he had to separate somehow from her. When his father died, she moved into Cambridge to be near him at Harvard. And then when she got married to Eleanor, she had a townhouse for both of them, and there was a door in between that she could come in between. So it was a complicated thing, because they were so close, for him to have to keep her so that she knew that he loved her, but have some independence on his own. And for Lyndon Johnson, too, I think at the beginning it was his mother. His mother was so proud of him. When he was like 2 years old, he learned the alphabet. When he was 4, he could recite poetry. It's hard to imagine Lyndon Johnson reciting passages of poetry. But then interestingly, when he got to school, he was pretty restless. School didn't speak to him in a way. And he wasn't a great student, though he was obviously really smart. and he took off a couple years. Much to her great dismay, he decided not to go to college, and he went out to California, tried to make it on his own with hard jobs, and he couldn't do it. He finally came back to college. And then when he got back there, then he was able to finally put all those talents. People don't bloom at the same time. FDR
Yes.
bloomed later than Teddy Roosevelt or Lincoln, and Lyndon Johnson did too. But that original love that the mother had, even though she sometimes withdrew that love when he wasn't doing well, which was really hard for him. And then later in life, he would follow that pattern sometimes when he'd be disappointed with somebody, he would just become icy with them rather than just giving them the affection that he had before. And then he returned to it sooner or later. But obviously, all of them had a huge amount to do. I mean, it sometimes can be a mentor, it sometimes can be a parent, it sometimes can be a friend. But often that drive for success, I think, is accompanied by somebody who helps you along the way, because everybody needs to have that somebody else believing in them to go forward, I think.
Fascinating. Yes. And just keeping an eye on time, I'm going to try to get one or two more questions in, but
Sure.
we could go for much longer. But I think on this note, we have a couple of really interesting questions. Mark specifically asked about the Roosevelt's wealth, and was that considered sort of in the political sphere a positive or a negative? How did the public in that time view the Roosevelt's personal immense wealth?
That's very interesting. I think, when FDR was first approached to run for the state legislature, they knew that his mother had the money and she could help contribute to the campaign. I think in some ways it was. They were able, however, eventually to not allow that privilege to divide them from working class people. And that's the key. I mean, sometimes you can come from that wealth, I think, and then you don't acquaint yourself enough with what's happening. In Teddy's case, he had been police commissioner. He'd understood tenements. He'd seen it all. In FDR's case, I said, as the polio had really made him understand what ordinary people were having to do in their everyday lives when he saw the other patients that had come from very different, unprivileged backgrounds from his own. So that it probably helped them in some ways because it gave them access to books, to learning, to in libraries, all the things that Lincoln didn't have. But in the end, they had to overcome that, and they all did. That's what politics at its best can do, Teddy said. It just gives you an access to other people in other classes and other places that you might not have if you were in a more narrowed world that your privileged background had allowed you to stay in.
Fascinating. Miriam, I think, has a really interesting question. She says that she's such a fan. She adores all your books, and she's wondering if there's a woman that you think encapsulates these traits that comes to that is top of mind. So many, I'm sure, but
Oh, there's no question, and partly because I lived with her, but Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, think about Eleanor. She grew up in a very difficult childhood. Her mother was considered one of the most beautiful women of her age. Portrait painters were coming to paint pictures of her. And her mother, Eleanor Felt, was always disappointed in her daughter's lack of a pretty face. She used to call Eleanor Granny when she was little because she looked so old when she was young. And her mother died when she was only 8 or 9 years old. Her father had been an alcoholic. Teddy Roosevelt's brother was her father, and comprehensively, they're all connected to each other.
yeah.
And then he died, and she was brought up by strict grandparents. But then luckily she went to a school in England where the headmistress saw her qualities, and she was an extraordinarily empathetic person. She was incredibly smart. She was very, very much of a leader in her class there. And the person who was the headmistress persuaded her, you don't have to go back and worry about being in debutante book. She was panicked about that. Just go back and do something. So she got involved in settlement house work. And she was much more acquainted with that by the time she met Franklin than he was in that. And then she became a leader who really forged ahead of her time on civil rights, on women getting to work in the factories. She also cared about other women's having the possibility. When she became First Lady, she had weekly press conferences where the only people who could come were female reporters. So all of a sudden, stuffy publishers had to hire their first female journalist. A whole generation got their start because of Eleanor. So she used that feeling of not being loved as a child, I think, to extend her love and affection and respect and caring for all sorts of other people. And I think became an extraordinary leader. She had the humility, she had the empathy, she had the resilience, obviously, from coming through that childhood experience. And her ambition was always for something larger than herself. So she was his equal. There's no question that he would not have been the president he was without her. And she needed him to provide the platform. But then after he died, she marched out on her own and was responsible responsible for human rights, getting into the UN Declaration, and led an incredibly noble life. I would love to have known Eleanor Roosevelt.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that question. A great answer. And perhaps this is a really important place to leave this before I throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts. Is just as we mentioned, as we've been saying, and before we signed on and during the call, we have over 300 people on the call, many of them teachers, and they would love to use this book in the classroom, whether they be middle school or high school students. That we've had many requests for that, and just having you on now, if you could just talk a little bit about maybe the best practice to integrate this great book into lesson planning, assignments. How would you instruct our teachers to go about using this great book in the classroom?
Oh, where I actually feel at this moment, because they would know so much better than me. There was one thing that Lincoln once said, better to remain silent and and appear a fool than to speak up and remove all doubt. But I guess the thing you'd do is you'd want them to somehow be able to integrate the stories of what they were like when they were young and how they developed the characteristics of character, the leadership traits, and then show also, just so it becomes relevant later. In the book, it just takes the main thing that each one of them did, the Emancipation Proclamation, or this big coal strike that Teddy settled, or LBJ and civil rights, and Lincoln, of course, then FDR and the early days of the Depression and a little bit of World War II. But it allows you to see there's a line. It's not a line of straight progress, but you see a line from those childhood qualities, so that the young people can feel, if I can develop these qualities, it'll make me a better person, because that's what matters. It's not just being a great leader. The best of our leaders were good people as well as good leaders. And what it means to be a good people are those qualities we've been talking about, of compassion and kindness and empathy and understanding and et cetera, et cetera. So I think if they can make that link, then they'll see them not only as boys, but as guys later on.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for this. So many great questions. We had so many great questions that we didn't get a chance to ask. I saw a great question in the chat about the leadership qualities of the 2004 Red Sox, which I love as a baseball fan. So another day for that
Another
question.
day we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
This was such a treat for me to be able to talk with and hear the questions from you and from everybody else. Thank you very, very much.
And Gina, I'll throw it back to you for some very quick final thoughts, but just a quick plug that for all people on this call right now, we will be honoring Doris in our spring gala. I'll be putting a link in the chat for that, for a little bit more information, but we're so happy to and looking forward to that in May of 2025. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts and a look ahead.
Yes, absolutely. This was a fantastic session. And we didn't even really get to talk about an unfinished love story. So Doris, we might have to have you back to discuss that as well, because that is a fantastic behind the scenes look at
that. It meant so much to me to be able to do that. So I would be very glad to talk with you about it.
Well, we would love that. And we know that a lot of you didn't get your questions answered. So a great remedy, as Ryan mentioned, is to go to bookshop.org, where you can purchase a copy of The Leadership Journey, as well as an unfinished love story. And the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And we hope you'll join us next week as we welcome The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens by Richard Haas. And you can go online to see this recording, as well as more than 250 scholar presentations at gilderlerman.org/bookbreaks. And you can also find documents, essays, History Now, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Doris, it was such an honor to speak with you today, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Me too. Thank you very, very much. Wow.
Have a great day, everyone.